Hello, everybody. This is Of Mountains and Men. I'm Peter Myers, and with me is
Rhys.
And we are on our second attempt here at this episode. So we originally tried to record an episode a couple weeks ago, actually, which is why if you're listening to this, it's probably a little bit delayed from when we normally put out episodes. But we sat down and had a really great conversation for a couple hours and discovered that our mixer had been recording without recording the audio. So that was fun.
It was totally my fault. Totally my fault.
I mean, I think it could have happened to anybody. That was, I think it was something at the beginning, right, where we were trying to adjust something with the sound, and I think we accidentally muted the audio input or whatever. So
yeah, that was confusing because we could hear each other. Sound was going through the system, but for some reason it wasn't going through into the recording portion of the system. But
yeah, this is why, at some point, if we keep doing this long enough, we just need someone like Jamie or Thursday or whatever, like Jamie from Joe Rogan or Thursday from Pat Fradd or whatever, who can just deal with all this stuff for us.
Well, dude, I've also we've been talking about doing videos, podcast, and I've been looking into it a little bit. And actually, do you have an iPhone?
No.
Okay. Good for you, I guess. What type of phone do you have?
Galaxy.
Yeah,
Samsung Galaxy S23.
Okay. Is that newer?
Yeah, it's the newest. Well, I mean, they just came out with the S24, but the S23 was the latest one.
Okay. Yeah, I've sold my soul to Apple. But so I have an iPhone, and actually a lot of people use smartphones because the cameras are high enough quality. And because, with podcasts, it's typically not one shot. I have a really nice camera.
Oh, you mean if we had both cameras?
Yeah, if we had a center shot and then a shot on you and a shot on me.
That's fair. Yeah, we could do that. Yeah.
I had to play with it. I'm not sure how different phones would work, but yeah, that would be something to play with. But I've had a lot of students requesting, Mr. Gabois, your podcast, you should do it on video.
I mean, I do want to do that. Yeah,
that
we've definitely talked about that.
That would be fun.
Yeah, I've actually intentionally avoided Apple. That's the main reason I don't have an iPhone, is because years ago when Apple was first becoming big, I think I obviously there's the initial, I think when I was first a teenager and iPhones were coming out, I was like, oh man, I kind of want an iPhone. But then the more that I learned about the whole Apple situation, I was very I don't I have very opinionated opinions about business and things like that. And I don't like the fact that Apple has that very exclusive, a lot of their stuff is designed such that it only works with Apple things, or that it's really hard to make it compatible with other things.
Yeah, I don't like that either. I think the only reason I have an iPhone is because my father, we're on a family plan, and the iPhone I have right now was one that he bought and decided that he didn't like it. And so he just gave it to me. And I was like, Dad, I don't need a new phone. I really appreciate it. That's nice of you. He's like, no, I just decided I'm just going to give it to you. It'd be easier if I just gave it to you. I'm like, would it though? Or do you just not want to go deal with the trading in and stuff? But
yeah.
So which isn't that messy, but no, I'm appreciative of that. But no, we could do it. We could go off on about phones and even the non-Apple products,
the
rechargeable batteries and stuff. But we're not going to just yet.
No, yeah. First, let's so we're going to talk a little bit about actually when we were planning this episode originally, I guess I suggested something about Lent, I think.
Yeah.
And I think you had a good idea to kind of broaden that a little bit more, to not make it quite so specific to Lent, but just more about the good in general, how to achieve the good, and sacrifice. I remember coming up as part of that conversation a little bit. And then you specifically sent me this video from Jonathan, which I still can't get his last name properly, but
Pageau,
yeah.
Pageau,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, about him kind of going on this thing. So I think maybe if we want to start once we get into that, of you giving a little bit of an explanation of that video, kind of a walkthrough to give people an idea of what we're going to be getting into, and we can kind of address that.
Yeah, my logic for like how I saw Lent and this conversation about the good as relatable is because Lent is about making sacrifices to help reorient ourselves to the ultimate good, which is Jesus Christ, okay, and the Trinity, this communion of love. That's why we make sacrifices during Lent. We give up these lesser goods to focus on the greater goods. But yeah, like it would be cool to kind of expand the audience a little bit, which you fortunately agreed with. And yeah, that's how this conversation about the good really came about. And it was on my mind because I saw this amazing video from Jonathan Pageau. It was at an ARC conference, which is ARC.
I looked it up last time.
It's Alliance for Responsible Citizenship.
That's what it is. Yeah.
So there's a bunch of great people who speak at this ARC conference. It's and there's some excellent talks on there. I've listened to Jonathan's, and there's another man who was talking about energy, and how energy is like one of the bigger problems of the world. And it was I haven't watched enough really to have an opinion on it or really even break it down, but it's a video that I definitely want to go back to. So do you want me to kind of like explain the video?
Yeah, I think it'd be good if you could give people kind of a little overview.
Yeah. So Jonathan Pageau, he's a little background before I actually jump into the video. He's a Russian Orthodox iconographer. An iconographer is someone who makes icons, and he does so by hand. He's very skilled. I strongly suggest you check out his website to see some of his art. It's beautiful.
Do you know what that website is? Because that sounds awesome.
It's just jonathanpageau.org or whatever. I think he has, because he has a podcast, or it might be Symbolic Word. Well, Symbolic Word is his podcast, and I can't remember if he has two websites. But if you go to Symbolic Word, I'm sure there is a link somewhere to his like store where he sells stuff. He also, I have a crew neck with one of his icons printed on it, and it's an image of Saint Michael casting Satan into hell.
Ooh,
yeah, which is like one of my favorite images ever.
Yeah.
But Jonathan's is he has Satan depicted as a dragon in his image, and so some people think it's Saint George and the dragon, and he does actually have an icon of that. But this one I have is it's beautiful. But there's some other pieces of his, like the creation of the cosmos. That is one of his designs. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check this out. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I definitely would suggest anyone listening to check out Jonathan's work. But Jonathan Pageau is buddies, and I mean like real buddies, with Dr. Jordan Peterson. And Dr. Jordan Peterson I've heard his daughter, Michaela Peterson, talk about Jonathan. Well, she actually had Jonathan on her podcast, and she was telling Jonathan that her dad thinks Jonathan is one of the smartest people that he knows, which is a
pretty
lot.
high praise from Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine? Yeah. And so I think what Dr. Peterson likes about Jonathan is how he sees the world and how he understands it, like symbolically, because he's really into symbolism. But this talk he gives at the art conference isn't so much about symbolism. It's just this simplification of reality, which we tried to do on our first episode, where we said these are the three options of how to live a life: an existentialist, a nihilist, or a theistic worldview.
Yep.
But Pageau kind of adds a little bit more to that discussion and simplifies it even more, I think. He doesn't simplify the options, but he helps us better understand why those three options are all we have. So he begins the conference by talking about, he asks a question. He's like, who here, well, this is what he says. Okay. He says, there's an elephant in the room, guys. There's an elephant in the room, and I think we need to address it. How many of you subscribe to some sort of religion? And you can't see everybody in the video, but it looks like everyone's raising their hand. Okay. And he says, how many of you subscribe to an atheistic worldview? And it seems like some people...
Yeah, presumably there was like a small number the way the video presents it. But...
Yeah. And Jonathan was very playful about it. He's like, we're writing your name down, He was being very charitable. But he was pointing out the fact that this art conference, this Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, most of these people were coming at it from a religious worldview. And so he says there's something to that. And he says we got to go back to the Greek philosophers. So we have the Greek triad, or the three great Greek philosophers of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But there's also the pre-Socratics. The pre-Socratics and the Greek triad, one of the big questions that they were trying to deal with is what is behind all of reality? Like what caused it to be? What designed it? What is fundamentally there behind all things? And some people, to help you better understand what I'm trying to say here, is some people theorized everything is water. Everything is water, just taken into a different form.
Yeah.
Okay. But there was one person, Democritus. I I had the name right. I remember. And do you remember which
I
name
think
said?
that's the right name.
Yeah,
isn't it?
Democritus.
That's the one you used last time.
Okay, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the right name. I should have double checked it. But Democritus, he theorized that reality was not water. He liked that idea, but he said reality, everything in the universe is made up of small things, like the small substance or these small beads. And that was one of the ideas. There's no way to prove it. But nowadays, given the increase in materialism and empirical sciences, a lot of people have thought that Democritus was right, because what it seems that Democritus is describing are atoms, and we think, oh, he's 100% right. All of reality, all of it originates from these simple particles. And it's not really atoms; it's protons, neutrons, and quarks, or I forget which three. I know it's quarks, and I think it's quarks and electrons that are the most fundamental particles. You can't dig deeper than that. And so some people think Democritus was right. Okay, it's just matter. That's all that's out there in the universe is just matter, and that's all that, to be use the same term, that's all that matters. Okay. So when the scientific revolution took place and they discovered the atom and they discovered the more simple particles, they think Democritus was right. And if all that is behind reality is just matter, just stuff, as Jonathan Pageau goes on to say, it seems that all we need then is more stuff in order to live fulfilling lives. Because if all that's behind everything is stuff, is matter, that's all we need.
Yep.
And we're in that stage, at least in the Western world, where we have more stuff than ever. You and I were talking about cell phones. It's one of the few things that almost everyone seems to have access to.
Yep.
And we use that thing to gain access to more stuff.
Yep.
And despite us having more stuff than ever, we're more unhappy than ever, is Jonathan's point.
Yep.
So people are quick to praise Democritus, but he thinks, Jonathan Pageau goes on to say that he thinks that's a very reductionist view of reality, to say it's just matter and it's just material. He goes on to say that he thinks Plato, who was not a pre-Socratic, a post-Socratic, or he was alive with Socrates, allegedly, or definitely was, but we're actually
good. I think
we're not even sure if Socrates existed.
Well, yes, correct.
Yes, that's
my point about,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, just so people understand why I said allegedly. Like Plato definitely existed. We're not sure if Socrates was made up by Plato as like the ideal philosopher, but Plato had this theory of the forms. Okay, and he argued that behind reality was this ultimate form, okay, called the good. Now, to help us better understand this, what Plato means by forms, okay, an example of a form would be beauty, okay? So let's say we're looking at a painting. Let's say we're looking at Jonathan Pageau's carvings, and we call them beautiful. Plato says those things can only be beautiful if they participate in the form of beauty itself. Otherwise, it's just a mere opinion, which the postmodernists say is what art is. It's just mere. It's the beauty is only in the eye of the beholder. Okay, but Plato says no. We're just playing imagination at that point. Yep. If we're calling things beautiful and it's all on the whim and it's how we feel. But Plato says for something to actually be beautiful, it must participate in this thing that is out there, that is beauty itself.
Yeah, and
he thinks that about most things that are descriptive. Or that we use to describe things. Ugly, well, not ugliness, I guess, but beauty. Yeah, there has to be beauty itself. And all these forms, he says there's an ultimate form, the form that is perfect, called the good. And he would say beauty is actually a part of this ultimate form as well. But there must be this thing out there, this form, goodness itself. Okay. And he goes on, and actually Aristotle develops this a little bit more. He has a different take than Plato, but Aristotle goes on to talk about the supreme good.
Yep.
Okay. And actually, I've been talking about this with my students lately. But the supreme good, this is a question worth spending your entire life trying to figure out, is there a supreme good? And if so, what is this supreme good? Because what Pageau goes on to say is, yes, we can say that matter is all that matters, but it's clearly not cutting it. It's not making us happy. He thinks Aristotle and Plato were more in line with what was true, because there has to be a supreme good out there. There has to be something greater and beyond us that leads us towards a fulfilling life. Because he says in this speech, imagine something that is the supreme good in your family or in your life, right? Guess what? It probably ain't it. And here's why. Because when you take something that is not the supreme and ultimate good of reality, like let's say family.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Which is noble. It's
Which
still
is
a
high
good.
good.
It's a high
but
good.
It's not
Yeah.
the supreme.
It's not the supreme good. When you take something that is not the supreme good, but make it your supreme good,
Mm-hmm.
Pageau goes on to say that tyranny and chaos will automatically ensue in your life. And here's an example how. Let's say I make my family my supreme good, my ultimate source of happiness. That means if they're my ultimate source of happiness, that I don't want anything bad to happen to them. But is it realistic for me to think that I can control and prevent anything bad, like everything?
Mm-hmm.
Like I can't prevent evil from happening to my family. And if I do, if I go all out, I become kind of psychotic. I become a helicopter parent and I become anxious all the time.
Yep.
This is what Pageau was kind of getting to. We're more anxious than ever.
Yep.
But I have this idea that I think I can control everything and keep my family safe, which is an absolute lie.
Yeah.
And so the family, it's a noble good. It's a high good. But it can't be the supreme good, because if I make it my ultimate good, I'm going to be obsessed with protecting it.
And I think if I may just like interject real quick too on that, like I think, and even more, like you're using a very good, clear, like extreme there with the family thing, but I think on a really basic level too, to help people relate with it even more, that I think people do a lot today, like with the family suggestion, is even if you're not necessarily obsessed with trying to protect them, but if you're trying to make your family your supreme good, then any time that someone in your family does something that upsets you or that, bothers you or that hurts you in some way, it's going to be magnified to this intense degree in your mind because you want everything to be perfect. Mm-hmm. Because if the family is the supreme good for you, then you're going to have this very high, to your point of the word control, like you're going to have this very high expectation, this very specific sense of control of like, this is what this should look like, versus the freedom actually to let go and say like, this is not going to be perfect. This is not going to be exactly how I expect it to be. It is a good, and I love them, and I love the good of this, but I'm not like going to have the, because expectations can be a very dangerous game in that way too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can quickly see how tyranny and chaos will ensue in your life. And so in the Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he says there has to be supreme good, because let's do a simple experiment. Like you're an accountant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Why are you an accountant? To what end are you an accountant?
Oh, to what end?
Yeah, to what end?
I mean,
what goal are you working towards? Let's simplify. Don't jump to
money.
To make money.
Honest.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, why are you trying to make money?
Ideally, to support myself right now, and then ideally to be able to support a family in the future.
Okay. Why do you want to support a family, or why do you care to support yourself? To what end are you
so
doing
that I can better for myself, so that I can better know, love, and serve God. And
okay, all right. So look at you. Yeah, you're going right to the ultimate reason.
I mean,
you're
that's
doing
just
it.
why I do it. But
which is good. No, that's Aristotle says we have to eventually arrive at an end which is sought for its own sake. There's nothing that goes past it, right? And that's what we call the supreme good. But Aristotle says if there's no supreme good, then what the hell are we doing?
Yeah,
we're just. I have goals in life. Okay, why do you have those goals? Oh, because they make me feel good. It's like that's not. Well, a lot of people fulfill those goals, buddy, and they don't feel good, first of all. Okay. Like feeling good is clearly not the highest good. Okay.
Exactly.
Because it's otherwise we would all just be doing heroin all the time, as Jordan Peterson says. Okay. It's just not going to cut it. We have to find something that we're doing for its own sake and is also worthy of being done for its own sake. So, and this is also the supreme good is the thing we use to say whether or not anything is good. Because let's say the supreme good is to know, love, and serve God. And you're discerning between whether or not you should, let's say you find $100 on the ground. Mm-hmm. You're trying to discern between whether or not you should pocket it or turn it into the grocery store that you found, where you outside the grocery store. Mm-hmm. You found the $100 outside the grocery store and you're wondering if you should go in and turn it in. Okay. The way to discern that is which action is more in alignment with the supreme good. Okay. Yep. Which action will help lead me towards the supreme good? And I would argue it's to turn the $100 in, because someone clearly lost it.
Sure.
And we're called to know, love, and serve God, and we're also called to know, love, and serve other people. Okay. And that's how we know, love, and serve God. So unless there's a supreme good, we have no device by which to appeal to, or not device, but we have no standard by which we appeal to call something good. Right. Mm-hmm. So if we had no supreme good, we're just like walking around aimlessly doing nothing.
No, but may I offer, let's say I am, I mean, sure, let's say I'm Peter, whatever, but let's say I'm making the argument, well, I'm an accountant because I want to make money so that I can be happy.
Mm-hmm.
What's your response to that?
So
Because isn't that a good? Like, why wouldn't that be okay as like the supreme good? Because I want to be happy.
Because you want to be happy. Let me try and understand the question. Like, make sure I'm understanding it the right way. So you're saying your supreme good is to be happy?
Yes.
Okay. Which I think, so this goes back to Aristotle's point, eudaimonia, which is translated as happiness. He says that the supreme good is happiness, but not everyone agrees upon what that thing is. So with that claim that you just made, I would ask a series of questions to see if the thing that you think will make you happy is actually possible or capable of doing so, or is it more likely to lead to tyranny and chaos? So actually, we didn't talk about this in our recorded, non-recorded episode, but I go over a criteria for the good with my students.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with the criteria for the good, like from Saint Augustine and even Blaise Pascal?
Well, why don't you refresh my memory and the audience's?
I just want to make sure. Yeah,
I think I've heard it, but it's been a while.
So in grad school, Saint Augustine, he says the good, first of all, it cannot be lost against our own will. What he means by that is we can't live in fear of losing the good. Okay. We can lose it, Augustine says, but only under our own volition, only under our own choices. Okay. Mm-hmm. But this thing that is called the supreme good, there can't be any chance at us losing it against our own will.
Okay. Yeah.
Because otherwise we become like money. Okay. Let's say money is the thing that you think that will make you ultimately happy. Okay. We can kind of think of Scrooge from A Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
The man obsessed with money, okay, and he's afraid of losing it, so he's kind of become, well, a Scrooge. He's become unfriendly, and arguably he doesn't seem happy because he's consumed with this thing that he calls the good, money, but it doesn't deserve to be called the good, so it just rules his life, and it actually enslaves him.
Yep.
So it can't be lost against our will. The second criteria is it must be immaterial, because material things can be destroyed.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So
because again, it can't be just logic, right? You're saying
it can't be lost against our will, and material things which can be destroyed, therefore, can be lost against our will. So it has to be immaterial. So it can't be lost against our will. It has to be immaterial, and then it can't change. Saint Augustine goes on to say, because change implies an increase or a decrease in quality. So if the supreme good can change, that means it can increase, which is a problem because it's supposed to be the supreme good. There's nothing better. You can't have the supreme good in your hands and imagine something better than it.
Correct. You know? Yeah, logically, that's just a logic thing.
Yeah, it's a superlative. It's not comparative. Oh, it's not a greater good. It's the supreme good. There's nothing beyond that.
Yeah.
But also, if it changed and got worse, it would no longer be the supreme good, and therefore we'd have to live in fear of the supreme good changing and becoming less than what it originally was for us.
Well, and also again by logic, if it was possible for the supreme good to no longer be the supreme good, then it wouldn't be the supreme good.
Exactly.
Because logically speaking, for something to be the supreme good, it has to be able to remain the supreme good for all of time, basically.
Yes, exactly. So those are the three criteria that Augustine kind of lays out. And then Blaise Pascal comes along and he says the supreme good also has to be infinite. And he says, why? So Blaise Pascal was a mathematician. Mm-hmm. And so his words, he's heavy in logic, because logic is just algebra with words, and he goes on to make the argument that we all have infinite desires. We have an infinite abyss of desires. Like, what's your favorite food?
Oh, gosh. Wow. I should have a really quick answer to that.
I don't have a quick answer to this either.
I guess it depends what you mean by favorite food. Like,
let's say it's Friday night and you're not going to make dinner and money's not a problem. And that doesn't mean it's going to be expensive either, but
I mean, it kind of depends, I guess.
It depends on what you're craving.
In that particular situation you just gave, I would probably get pizza because it's like convenient and like nice and easy to, like a chicken bacon ranch pizza. Although I wouldn't eat that on a Friday, but anyway.
So chicken bacon ranch pizza. That's your favorite pizza?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
It is.
If you had it tonight, would you never need it again?
Oh no! Of course, I would still want it. I would have.
Because your desires are going to come back.
Want more. I would have the desire for it more times. Yeah.
Yeah. Your desire is never. All human desires are never satisfied. They're unending, and therefore they're infinite by nature. And so Pascal says this is obvious to everyone. Logically, Pascal goes on to say, if our desires are infinite, the only thing capable of satisfying our desires must be infinite itself. So the good has to be infinite because we have an infinite abyss. The only way to fulfill an infinite abyss is infinity itself. It's a math equation, you know? And then Pascal goes on to make the argument the only thing conceivable in the universe that is infinite, and it also I would argue that matches up with the other three criteria that St. Augustine mentions, is God.
Yep.
Right? Yeah. So when you ask that question, what if, Rhys, I'm saying money will be the thing that makes me happy? I'd be like, okay, can you control the fact that you have money? You can do a pretty good job. You can work hard. You can be dedicated. Okay, that's cool. And there's virtue behind working hard, right? And wanting to take care of yourself. That is a good. But you can't guarantee it.
Well, and I think to the point you just kind of, to that whole explication you just gave, like if I'm saying happiness is my supreme good, then happiness though still doesn't fit that criterion that you just gave, because you can have a decrease of happiness through, various circumstances that happen in your life. Like you're not always going to be happy every moment of the day. Like that's just not possible. No. And so by the definition that we just gave for what the supreme good has to be, then happiness can't be the supreme good inherently.
When you say happiness, do you mean like a worldly understanding of happiness, or?
Well, yes, and that's probably something that I should have clarified, because that was part of the point that I was getting at too, of like, I think one of the questions I would ask of me if I were the one, interviewing this person who theoretically is saying that their supreme good that they're going for is happiness, is I would try to get to a definition of what are you calling happiness?
Yeah.
Because I guess what I was intentionally referring to was what I consider the more worldly perspective on happiness these days. By worldly, I mean what the world generally says about happiness, which is really more based around pleasure than around Aristotle's view of eudaimonia, which is like the true fullness of happiness in God, which is the way that Aquinas would take it the extra step, but versus the happiness of the world today, which is really more, people will say they want to be happy, but oftentimes what they're referring to is they want to feel pleasure, they want to feel good in this like more physical sense of that than in the deeper sense.
Yeah, it's more of a sensorial positive experience. I like to understand eudaimonia, or however you pronounce it, you probably know better than I, is human fulfillment.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I agree.
Okay,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Happiness is complicated and it's interpreted differently, but we're talking about something, because you can be you can be fulfilled and sad.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. It's definitely an option. So that's why.
Wait, hold on.
Let's pick it apart. Yeah.
You can't be fully fulfilled and sad. You can be like partially fulfilled, because the thing is that this is like, I think we talked about this in the like recorded episode that never happened, but is that you can't like, we will never be fully fulfilled in this life, like on earth. Like the only way to fully encounter that fullness of fulfillment is the next life, is what we're proposing, at least, is what a Catholic would propose. And so like that's I think one of the dangers too of the making things into the good or whatever, the supreme good that people are going for, is recognizing that even within fulfilling things, we have to be careful. Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who is this great, like, famous archbishop who preached a lot of public things, was on TV a lot back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, has this great book, 3 to Get Married, for married couples. And one of the things that he talks about multiple times in that book is the fact that even in marriage, which is this profoundly good thing, and where spouses can find a sense of fulfillment in the marriage, in each other, but one of the biggest dangers that happens a lot of the time, even in the best marriages, is this sense of trying to find their ultimate fulfillment in their spouse or in the marriage in this life. And like recognizing that the only one who can truly fulfill us, the only person, thing, object, not to use that in the wrong sense, but is God. Like that's the only way we can be fully fulfilled. And I think that's the one thing that like, because even that, I'm glad you said that, because that is a good point, that like you actually can't be, you can be partially fulfilled and sad, but if we attain the fullness of fulfillment in heaven, we wouldn't be sad at that point.
You're true.
At least supposedly, I think we wouldn't be, but
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's
theologian
contemplating.
could speculate about that, but
Contemplating heaven is sure it's difficult to really think about because you would also think like, what if someone who you love is
that
not
was
in
what
heaven,
I just
right?
thought of
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah, that's something theologians speculate about sometimes, but
yeah.
I still think it would be a different definition than sadness per se. But
Probably.
yeah,
Yeah. So I'm happy also you brought up like the not analogy, but the example of marriage, because I could go off on marriage and the good, and
I mean,
there's like I think in the episode that we're gonna keep referencing, this unreleased, unrecorded episode,
basically just a conversation between Rhys and I.
which was a great conversation. But there's this movie that I'm not gonna name because it's super inappropriate, and I remember I brought it up previously. But there are these two characters. They're not the main characters. They're side characters, but they're divorced. But they're friends with a married couple, so they still see each other frequently. And at the end of the movie, they decide to get back together. And there's this line, like they're kissing. They're like, "Let's have a baby." And the man's like, "Yeah, that'll solve all of our problems." And I find that line hilarious because clearly this couple got married. I feel like I can psychologically dissect them because they're not real. You know, it's a made-up couple. But like, it seems to be the case that this couple got married because they thought that this would be the thing that grants them ultimate happiness, which is marriage. And Disney has totally ruined it. Like, Disney has taught us this idea of happily ever after, which original fairy tales really don't do that, right?
Yeah,
Like,
no.
so I read another tangent. I've been reading Grimm's fairy tales to my kids before bed.
Oh, nice, yeah.
And I always pull out the book. They're like, "We don't like that book." But then I start reading it, and my oldest son, like, he'll start listening. And the last book, a book I read, or a story I read this past week, ended with the character dying. But it was like the character lived a long life and then died. And then my son was like, "Why did he die?" And it's like, "Am I going to die one day?" And I'm just like, "Oh, dude." But we had a really good conversation about death with my 5-year-old.
That's good.
Yeah, he has a pretty good understanding of it because I had a cousin who died last year. And
that's
so
right.
I had to leave for a funeral, and my son was like, "Where's Dad going?" He's like, "Oh, cousin so-and-so died." And so my son's actually had a pretty good introduction into the concept of death. But nonetheless, I was Disney has kind of taken fairy tales and has ruined, like, gotten rid of the ugly part. Like, I was recently watching Pinocchio with my students because it has a lot to say about the good life, you know. And I got this idea from Dr. Jordan Peterson. He loves Pinocchio because he thinks it does such a good job at talking about what virtue actually is, and what happens when you live the not so good life. But apparently, the original ending of Pinocchio is he is hung. He's like killed. He's put to death. And he also kills Jiminy Cricket. It's like, what? It's like, I didn't get that vibe at all in the Disney adaptation of Pinocchio. It's wild. But Disney is trying to like sugarcoat everything and teach this thing like happily ever after. And it's always after the wedding.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest lie ever. Like, I'm happy with my marriage. I really am. But there have been times throughout my marriage where I have based my happiness off of my wife, like all of it. Okay. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with taking joy in your spouse. Okay. That it is a high good. And I think you and I would agree with that. But it's not the ultimate good. And it's actually, you could characterize it as harmful.
Exactly.
It's very harmful.
It very much is.
To tell to think of my wife as my God.
Well, because the thing is, they will always fall short of that. And
she will always
that's not at all.
me.
That's not at all like a knock on your wife. She's a great woman.
I would fall short,
but
too.
It's exactly. Yeah. That's the point. It's that you're both human beings, and so you're never gonna fully live up to that expectation of like you're my everything. I mean, that's one of the things that has always bothered me about the language that's so often used too, of like with spouses or even like dating relationships, significant others, of like you're my everything, you're my all, you're, you know, like it's like. On the one hand, I get it in the sense of like, you know, I'm in a relationship and I get the thing of like the desire there and just this romantic feeling and all that, and that's good. But on a deeper level, like if you actually do turn that person into your everything or your all, which people do far too often, it's going to fall short. And it's usually going to lead to disaster, to that tyranny and chaos that, Jonathan Pageau is talking about. Like,
No, yeah, it's you're spot on, and I think that's why the divorce rate is so high. Because it's not fair to make our spouses our gods, and it's actually an uncharitable thing to do to them. So
exactly.
So I think that kind of leads us into the second part of this conversation. So there seems to be a need for a supreme good. Okay, but I think we spent some time originally. We were talking about what are some things that the modern world makes the supreme good, and how that tyrannizes our world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think we can kind of go through a list of a few of those things.
Yeah. So you start.
Well, I'm trying to remember too, because I think we used categories last time, which I think was helpful, right? Of like kind of different aspects of that. Because I know I named some things like money, of course, I think is one of the most common ones nowadays. Money, like artifacts or things like that.
Yeah, all my students who I love dearly, if I ask them what do they want in life, they just want to make money.
Yeah.
And I don't get it. I try to be charitable with my students, and that's probably the one that I struggle with the most, when they say money will be the thing that makes them happy. Because even in a world where it has a disordered view of the good or doesn't believe in the good, I feel like it's just so blatantly obvious that money ain't it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, I mean, this could lead a little bit into like a conversation again about TikTok, but
well, yeah, we did talk
because we did talk about that last time, and it would be fun to go into that again. But I think that's something where I that's a big part of the argument to me for why, especially kids who are like the age that you're talking about, like your students, like high schoolers and people like that, believe so strongly that money is what will make them happen, because that's what because
I'm looking something up.
Because that's what brings them, like that's what they're told constantly by the world, and especially by influencers on things like TikTok. Like the big thing nowadays, like I think we've talked about this before too, of like how often like kids will say, instead of the old school answers, and by old school I mean from when we were growing up, like not that long ago, 15, 20 years ago or whatever, of like, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, a fireman, a policeman, a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever. A lot of kids will say things like they want to be an influencer. Like, and like, I'm not trying to necessarily say that there's something like inherently wrong with that, but it is an odd concept when you think about it, because what is that actually like? I think one of the reasons that, actually, I've never thought about this in a ton of detail, but I think one of the reasons that bothers me is because what does that actually do to benefit the world? Like, at least you can make the argument with a lot of those other things that there's a very clear correlation between, being a doctor or a nurse or, a policeman or a firefighter or a construction worker or an attorney or an accountant or whatever, or a teacher. Like, there's a lot of those like career paths, for lack of a better term, do something. Like, yeah, they make money for that person, but they also like do something in some way to benefit the world and society in a very like clear, tangible sense. Now, granted, obviously I have my own feelings about like accounting benefiting the business world and stuff like that. but like in general, they do something to benefit society. What does like an influencer do to benefit society? Like that is an interesting question that, I'm sure there's people who would argue that with me, and fair enough, I'd be happy to have that conversation. But I think that's an interesting point of like what that gets down to with, kids saying like, oh, I just want to make money. Like, well, okay, where does that come from? Like,
I think it comes from, the more I think about it, the more I just despise capitalism.
Yeah, I mean,
I understand the free market is the best way to respect the dignity of the human person, albeit when it becomes corrupted, it clearly violates the rights of human beings. But, like, where does that desire for money come from? First of all, I think there's this kind of there's this worldview, especially in the Western world, and not just the Western world, parts of the Eastern world too, to be successful, and how that is correlated to honor. And the best way to see that success is through material gain. And that's why I would argue, like, being a teacher, people look at that as kind of noble. But let's be honest, if you're at a cocktail party and someone tells you that their kid is in med school, you're going to be much more impressed with that than a kid who's studying to become a teacher.
Yeah.
You know? So we clearly have this predisposed worldview in our culture that values material gain. So I think there's that. It's more complicated than that, because also I think fear is a big part of money, because people think that, sure, like when I press my students on the concept that money is what will make them happy, they say, sure, like, I get it, Mr. Grabwell, that money can't be our supreme good, but it's going to make life a lot easier because you just don't have to worry about things. And I just think, and so what I was checking on my phone while you were talking there is the suicide rate of celebrities and wealthy people. And so when I hear students say things like that, I try not to talk about suicide too much in my class, but I think, but I think to myself, I'm like, okay, then why are rich people killing themselves more than the everyday citizen? I'm not sure if that's statistically correct, but I couldn't pull up exact statistics. But the article I was reading was making the claim, like, why do celebrities have a higher suicide rate than the everyday citizen? And also another thing to look at is, like, when I've been to Tijuana, Mexico to do mission trips, or to do a mission trip. And by mission trip, I was building a house. I wasn't evangelizing per se. But I went there at least twice, and the poor people in Tijuana who live in a very small house with a big family looked a lot happier than we did.
Yeah.
And they do not possess any material gain. And of course, people will respond to that and say, well, yeah, but they're forced to care about the simple things. And that's, well, I'm like, okay, yeah. And but
see,
but
that's
they seem
not
a lot
that's
happier,
not
though.
the worst thing to me. Yeah, exactly. And like, because I've had the same experience on mission trips I've been to in South and Central America. And you know, people will be like, oh, well, we shouldn't glorify poverty because it's such an awful thing. And like, fair enough. I'm not necessarily trying to glorify poverty, but I do think that there's a clear correlation there that the less things around them, the less things to distract them that they have, the more they have some sort of relationship with their family and with the Lord and all those things. And I mean, it's said right there in the Gospels too, if it's easier for a rich man it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, which is considered to be a very, very hard thing to do, than it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. So, you know, there's a clear correlation there. And on the one hand, like, I think it's fair to say that, like, because of the fallen nature of human beings, we're always going to find some sort of thing to try to put first before the supreme good. But, you know, something that's going to cause that tyranny, something that we're going to try to propose as our supreme good. But at the same time, I do think that money specifically and, like, material things is one of the most, like, maybe diabolical in a sense, like one of the easiest to, like, become that thing, one of the most profound that, like, often will become the thing that, like, ends up being our supreme good.
Yeah, I mean, this is my main objection to Karl Marx's theory of communism. I know he didn't start the theory of communism, but his Marxist communism is the most popular, it seems, out there. And he was a materialist. He believed that human fulfillment was found in material fulfillment. And if we just gave human beings exactly what they needed, everyone would be happy. Okay. And obviously, communism has never gotten to that point where it's able to grant everyone the necessary material to thrive. But even if it did, we would still be asking, okay, what more is out there? Because these rich people who have more than they could ever imagine are still killing themselves. They're still giving up on life.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that, like, perhaps the students in your class probably don't realize because, you know, they're young, and I used to think similar things to what they're proposing. But, like, I've discovered myself in even just having left seminary a couple of years ago and getting into the accounting world and realizing how easy it is for, like, when you start to have money to then be like, oh, well, it'd be really nice to have just a little bit more.
Yeah.
and then just a little bit more. Like it's I mean, yeah, I think it's, I don't think it's that big a deal for me to share this. I mean, it was like crazy for me to realize when I got my first raise of, I had to literally like, I had this initial reaction. Like, I think in general, I felt like I have been able to like detach myself a lot from money and material things and stuff over the last several years of kind of, the intense like life of being a seminarian and things like that. But I got my first raise as an accountant, and my initial thing was like, so I had not been well, let's just say that like it changed my perspective a little bit for a little while, and I was like, man, like, I could stick in this, I could get more money, like, and then I like realized, like, that day basically I realized that was the immediate thought that was popping into my head, was like wanting to like do more to get more money. And I was like, whoa, that's not how I want to live my life. Like, that's like not, that goes against like all of how I have, positioned myself to view money and view things. But it's like so interesting how it, I think like the phrase that's been used before of money corrupts. Like, I think sadly it does. Like, it just kind of inherently gets into us, and we're like, oh, and so like to that point of like people wanting to make enough money that they're not worried about things. It's one thing to say that, and that's great. I actually used to say that a lot myself. Like, growing up, I always said like, I don't want to be rich, but I just want to make enough money that I can live comfortably, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. And what I've realized is that A, living comfortably is not all that it's cracked up to be. And B, and now granted, to be clear, when I say that, I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to glorify poverty. I'm not saying it'd be great to be, living on the street or something. But I'm just saying that like living comfortably in the sense that I was thinking of it is not all it's cracked up to be. And then also recognizing that it's not that easy to stop at that point. It's not that easy to be like, oh, well, I've just got what I need to live comfortably and I'm satisfied now. Like, there's still always going to be this desire for more.
Well, that success is kind of addicting, I think. Like, I'm trying to be a little more careful what I say.
Yeah.
But once you start to get financial success, I get it, right? You're like, ooh, that feels good. It's like, let's get that dog in me. It's going to keep like grinding to make more cash. And once you taste that success, it's kind of, it feels good, and it definitely corrupts. And I think there's also another side to this that I'm wrestling with a lot, actually, is our obsession with financial security. And like you said, we're not trying to glorify poverty, but Jacob Imam and Mark Barnes at New Polity, the podcast, which I haven't listened a lot to. And Efren, he's been kind of like, he was telling me, he's like, once you start listening to them, it just makes you question everything about like your finances. But a New Polity, they're saying some pretty radical things. Like, you shouldn't have a 401k. You really shouldn't even be feeling the need to insure everything that you have. Mm-hmm. And you should trust in God. Now, obviously, we are required by law to have auto insurance, but
like often you're required to have renter's insurance, homeowner's insurance, things like that. But like, fair enough.
Yeah, right, yeah. But there's this need for comfort, and the way poor people can feel comfortable is pay insurance. But then you think of how much money they're spending on insurance, and then they're enslaved to the fear of. Like, insurance is fear. Like, that's literally what it is. Mm-hmm. It is fear. And maybe I'm being over-exaggerating insurance, but it seems like just such a...
I mean, I do think that, like, it's fascinating to me because, obviously there's Catholic things like the Knights of Columbus literally has a huge insurance program.
Life insurance one,
the idea, life insurance. And the idea behind that is meant to be that, like, the Knights of Columbus were founded to help support widows and children of men who had died. And so fair enough. Okay. That makes sense. Life insurance for the husbands. And that way, if they, but at the same time, I do think there's an interesting question that could be had about that insurance, almost like a lot of insurances almost like fly in the face of Catholic teaching in one sense. Like, not, I'm not well-versed enough in it to like necessarily make that argument definitively, but I'm just saying I think you could could look into it a little bit and could make some degree of argument based on that, because we're not called to, like, I guess I'm more thinking of like the gospel of like, of Jesus saying, don't store up riches on earth that are perishable things or whatever. And one of those in a certain sense is money. And I think that's why, like, to your point, I want to circle us back a little bit in a minute here. But first, just to kind of go down this road a little bit of the 401k thing, I think is a great example, because something that has bothered me for a few years now that I've realized more is this like retirement culture that we live in of I'm going to grind. And I think I might have actually talked about this on the podcast a few episodes ago, but just like to kind of reiterate that of the importance of recognizing that, like, having that success of like grind, and then save up a bunch of money in a 401k and all these different stocks and savings plans and all that. And then that way I can hit, 50 or 60 and just retire and go fly around the world and have fun. Like, that's not really the Christian life. Like, when you really dig deep into what our Lord calls us to, like the desire of our Lord is to know, love, and serve him. And one of the ways that we should ideally, I would say, be serving him is not by storing up money so that we can go enjoy the pleasures of life, but using our money well to serve the poor and to serve our family and our friends and everyone in the present moment more than in the future. I think that's part of the point of the storing up riches thing, is that it's preached so often by our Lord in the Gospels of we don't know the time and the hour that we will die, or that the world will end, either one. Mm-hmm. And so in some sense, it's very presumptuous of us to say, well, here's my plan. I'm going to live till X age, and I'm going to store up this amount of money so I can like retire at X age and then have enough to live for 30, 40 years on that retirement and do these things. Like, we're making a whole lot of presumptuous plans there that seemingly the Lord doesn't necessarily call us to do.
No, it seems to go. It seems to explicitly go against the idea that the Lord teaching us, do not worry about tomorrow.
Exactly.
Like, there's literally no point. And this is something I've had to really reflect on. Is just there's literally no point in worrying about tomorrow, because guess what? Worrying about it will not change what happens tomorrow.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I think that's something we have to consider.
And I think reeling it back in, I think this is all very relevant to our conversation, because a lot of these things, they contribute to what Pageau is talking about, of like that tyranny, that anxiety and stuff that comes because, to your point, like a lot of the things around insurance, retirement, all of that contributes to this mindset that people have of just being super anxious about tomorrow. Like, to the point you just made of our Lord saying, like, don't worry about tomorrow. Like, people are very anxious about trying to save up as much as they can for retirement, and about, making sure that they have all the insurance, because, oh man, if something happens, like, and it causes this intense amount of stress that we don't need to live with.
No. Yeah. And it exactly causes tyranny in our lives. That's what I'm thinking as my students are saying money is going to be the thing that makes them happy. And there's part of me that's hypocritical, because I'm constantly worried about money too. So it's two different aspects of like money. Is like money's going to be the thing that makes me happy, or no, financial security is going to be the thing that makes me happy. They're kind of the same, but kind of different. But no, I think that's a good example of something that we've made the highest good, or maybe not even the highest good, but just a higher good than it deserves to be. Because I think that's also something we haven't considered, is taking something that is a high good or lesser good, but making it higher than it deserves to be, will also cause chaos.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
So
that's a good point. Because there should be a hierarchy of goods coming down. I think we talked about this a little bit in the thing that didn't get released, but the supreme good versus, like the supreme good, then maybe our family, let's say, then, like there's a hierarchy in the goods of different goods, and definitely money is not at the top of that list, or even necessarily in the top 3 or 4 or whatever.
Yeah, we totally act like it is.
Yeah.
So, money is one of those things. Material gain is one of those things that we consider a high good, which we probably really shouldn't, and we can see its effects on the world.
I think another thing, I want to see your thoughts on this. I think another thing that I've found really interesting that's kind of an intangible in a certain sense, but I think it is relevant to this, is this, I'm not sure what the right word for it is. Maybe you can give it a word, but is the desire to have the things, like the latest things, or like to keep up with others, or to, that like comparison game almost of like the iPhone thing or the TikTok thing or whatever. Of the example, the iPhone maybe is the easiest one because we talked about it earlier too, but of like there has been this culture around Apple products for whatever it is, 20 years now, since the iPod originally came out, of like, oh, that's like the thing that everyone should have. Like, I want to have an iPod. I want to have an iPhone. Like, I want to have the latest iPhone. Like, this like, it's a little bit intangible, I think. It's related to material things. But, like, the desire, that desire almost be in and of itself, I think, is, like, being made into a good of, like, competing with, either, like, I don't know, what's the word?
Status?
Like, you know what I mean?
Really,
yeah, maybe that's what it is. Status, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I bring up this point with my students all the time about the difference between Android and Apple. And yesterday, my kids picked up on what I was doing, so they actually took it really well. Like, I ask a class every once in a while, like, who here has an Android? And like, no one wants to raise their hand. You know what I mean? Because
of course,
if you're in a group
high school, that's like, oh man.
Well, even like in adults, like if you get, like when I got my iPhone, there were so many people who were like, oh, you're texting in blue. Like, you're like, that's awesome. You have an iPhone now. It's like, finally, Rhys has an iPhone. But the Android, I'm pretty sure like it shows up in green. So if you're in
that's what I've heard. Yeah.
So if you're in a group chat, like you're ruining.
Mine has showed up as green for years.
Yeah. So if you're in a group chat, everyone makes fun of you once they see your green text box show up. So yeah, there's definitely a status, but that status goes beyond also just Apple, but like all material things. And it's
exactly.
And so this is critiquing capitalism again. But while Marxist theory, like his communism is like awful, I think his critique of capitalism is it's a pretty good critique. Like he says, in order for capitalism to succeed, it has to continuously innovate. So capitalism is kind of like choking itself. So
wow, that was actually, as much as I don't agree with Marxism, that was prophetic, really, because you look at the U.S. nowadays, and that's pretty much what's happening.
No, it's probably one of his best points, I think, in the manifesto, and so that's why Apple comes out with an iPhone every year.
Yeah,
which is insane, and it's not just
and
like,
entirely unnecessary.
Well, it's like I had a buddy from high school, going back all the way to elementary school, actually, but. His dad played video games, and so did he. And he was, Madden. You ever heard of Madden?
Oh, yeah.
The football game.
I played that once back in the day, yeah.
Yeah, they play, it's a new Madden game every
year. Every year, yep.
But there's not that much of a difference. And so he would intentionally, like, only buy a new Madden game every other year, to appreciate the difference.
I mean, that's good, yeah.
Yeah. And so there's some logic behind it. But we have to have the newest thing.
Yep.
Otherwise, our status drops. And that's just kind of absurd. It's like, as long as it's working, and like Apple has been, many cell phone companies have actually been caught. Like, when you download.
Oh, like the oh gosh, what's it called? The throttling or whatever. Is that what you're talking about?
Where they decrease
they throttle the speed so that, like, because of, or whatever it's called, where like they like make it so that the older phones, when they get updates, they like slow down how they work so that people will want the new ones. Yeah.
And I know some companies have been caught doing that, and so every time it's like they're even pushing it in that way with software, which is insane. But so what you're saying, I think it adds up, but I think it's sourced in this capitalist mindset, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's this. Yeah, I think status is a good way to put it, because it's like this. It's this desire to compare ourselves to others and to be like, well, so-and-so has that thing, so I should have that thing. Like, it's really funny. I just had this conversation with my girlfriend last night about, like, she was bringing up that apparently there's you've probably seen these. I kind of know what they are, but I'm not in the circles where I see them super often. But apparently there's this thing now called a Stanley Cup.
Oh my gosh.
That like every high schooler has, apparently,
every
because
high school
like,
girl has,
well, yeah, which they're apparently absurdly expensive. For what they are. They're like $50 or something like that. And that's a great example to me of like something that is like way more expensive than it should be, unnecessary in like every sense of the word necessary. Because, it's not that it's like not useful, but it's unnecessary. It's not like you need one of those.
Right.
But most of the people who get them, it's because, oh, well, everyone else has one, or some influencer on TikTok had one, which this is one of the reasons I don't like TikTok, is because of this kind of thing. Like, people will see what some influencer on TikTok has, and all of a sudden they want to have that thing. And it just leads to this thing where we're putting these other things first. And I think that's a thing where oh my gosh, what did we call it? Now I'm forgetting all of a sudden. But what did we call this? Status. Sorry,
status.
The status thing becomes the supreme good, not just the material thing. Like, the material thing is almost like a symptom of a deeper issue of people wanting to like have that status of like, well, I have this thing.
Well, it's a sacramental worldview, the lower S sacrament, where I see something physical and it signifies to me.
Oh,
what's
yeah.
going on immaterially within you. That's been true before capitalism. I was actually having this discussion with my neighbor about a strange discussion on racism, and it led to us making the conclusion that tanning and its relationship with racism. Because apparently, like, it's weird, our culture, like, I can't say this, but I'll say something else.
Yeah, please.
But we're obsessed with tanning.
I know, it's weird.
And it's weird because, like, in a lot of the Eastern countries, like apparently in South Korea, someone told me, and I'm pretty sure this is the case in China, like, not having darker skin is actually, like, people will walk around with umbrellas in the sun to not get tan in a lot of those countries. Because, and that Eastern perspective on tanning is actually typically more in alignment with how most of the world used to think. Because if you think about it, the people who were tan were the ones working out in the field. So if you had,
so it'd be a status.
So it'd be this physical, it'd be this tangible sign of who you actually were, which is a serious diminishment of the human person. But it was I was like, oh, I wonder what that connection is to like racism based off of the color of someone's skin. Like, is it actually rooted in how we view tanning? But it's kind of weird how it's flipped in America. But nonetheless, in America, like, how tan you are is also like a status.
Yeah.
Like, if you go to the beach and you're like,
paly,
you're
like
me,
pasty white guy like me,
like, it's looked down upon, and it's weird. So yeah, status is something we're concerned about, which is this going back to Pinocchio. Actually, Pinocchio, his goal is to become a real boy, and his first hiccup in that journey to becoming a real boy is he's on his way to school, and the fox and this cat, I think, convince him to go work for Stromboli, who's a puppeteer. Because they see Pinocchio as a puppet.
Is the guy's name actually Stromboli?
Stromboli. Yeah.
Like the food?
Yeah.
That's great. Anyway,
but,
sorry, go on.
That's all good. But, I mean, because clearly Pinocchio is a puppet who's autonomous, who doesn't need strings, so there's a lot of money to be made there. But it's weird, because Pinocchio has a goal of being a real boy, but he accepts his lesser identity as a puppet to gain the praise of others, because he becomes a star. But,
oh my gosh, that's so profound.
See, fairy tales are insane, man. You should watch Dr. Jordan Peterson break it apart.
I wonder who wrote that, because whoever it was, that was a very interesting.
It's fascinating. And so what actually ends up happening is Pinocchio has success in his career. It's short lived, but he tries to go home, and then Stromboli locks him in a cage. And it seems what Dr. Peterson and many others have interpreted that as is, when your happiness becomes dependent upon the approval of others, it literally encages you. It enslaves you, because you can't control what people think about you. This status that you're talking about, that we're obsessed with, it's actually idiotic.
Yep.
To try and obtain it, because I cannot control what you think about me. I can try and influence you, but it's never a guarantee. And that means we're kind of developing a society that can't, and I struggle with this myself. We're raising citizens and people to not be okay with people not liking them.
Yeah, exactly.
And you have to be okay with people.
You have to accept.
I mean, it's absurd to think you can get everyone to like you, right?
Yep.
Like, it's absolutely absurd. And when you become obsessed with being liked, you literally become enslaved to the opinions of others. Yep. So who's really in control? And who are you really? You're not yourself. You're what you think the world wants you to be. And that's
yeah. And I mean, I'll share from a little bit from like personal experience that for many years, I think because of that, and because of some like wounds that I had in my own heart and everything, for a long time, I literally used to call myself, like, I would say that I'm like really good at being like the chameleon. Like I can like go into a room and just kind of, be whatever I think people want me to be or whatever, be the guy that will fit in that group or whatever. And guess what? Eventually I finally figured out that like people actually don't like that. Like it might seem like they do in a certain way, but in the deeper meaning of it, they want to know who I actually am.
At least the good people do.
Not who not who I'm like trying to present to them.
Yeah.
Like, yes, to be clear, like people who actually want to be friends with me in the real sense of friendship, like in the deeper sense, they care more about knowing me and knowing what I like and don't like and who I am and how I view the world and things like that. And the fascinating thing was it was so damaging to me too, because I have then over the past, like, I don't know, 8-10 years had to kind of like, as a very much adult, had to try to like understand myself in a way that ideally I would have known a long time ago, but have had to kind of recognize like, okay, what do I actually like and dislike? How do I actually view the world? What are my like actual opinions, views, thoughts, like what, and like how do I express those to people too? And I think that's something that a lot of people, because of this status thing, they try to make it into a god, and then to your point, it enslaves them. And I picture that actually, I took that a little bit of a step further than you were of like, but I think in some ways you could use a lot of these things we're talking about as analogous to like the devil is using these things to enslave us. Like
for sure.
That's the step I was thinking of, the cage of like, yeah, it's exactly where the devil wants you to be, is in this dark kind of prison cell of your own mind, your own like fears about what people think about you and about, the status and about all these things, that you're so like self-focused. That's one of the things too, is that it becomes this very selfish thing. I was actually just watching an old episode, because I hadn't seen it before, of Matt Fradd from a couple of years ago, where he was interviewing this guy, John Edwards. I don't know if you saw that episode or heard of him, but the guy like had struggled with cocaine for years.
Oh, yes.
And it was an incredible story to hear how this guy's journey of like kind of being able to break that eventually, and like healing and his encounter with the Lord and everything. But it was so interesting to hear him talk about how anxious and fearful he was all the time that people would find out. He was so afraid that people would find out that he was struggling with this, that he was, doing cocaine, and what they would think of him and how they would view him. And it was when he actually finally had the freedom to say, I mean, it came through being arrested actually, but it was, a lot of times people hit rock bottom. That's what helps them. But in that situation, when he was arrested, he didn't fight against it. He finally gave up and was like, I have to accept the fact that people are going to know this about me, and just let it go. And like that freedom actually gave him the freedom to be able to let go of it and begin to get help with rehab and all the things he needed to move forward.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is so, that we need to trust in the supreme good, not the goods of even things like status, like an immaterial good like that.
Yeah, I mean, we could almost make an argument that status itself, I mean, because in the original episode, we talked about things that just actually aren't good at all. Like you made an argument for TikTok.
Yeah, which I would love to make that argument. But
do you think? I wonder what you think about this. Do you think status itself is good at all? And it depends on what you mean by status.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what do you mean by status? Can you give some sort of definition? Maybe we should have defined that earlier. But
yeah, like when I think the word status, I think the opinion people in your community have about you.
Okay, then yes, I think I would agree that inherently should be. I don't know that I would say it's immoral, but I think I would say that it's indifferent insofar that it shouldn't matter. Like it shouldn't matter insofar that we should be. How's the right way to put this? Like, ideally, I guess it comes down to like, because what you were asking about comes more down to like ideals. And so in an ideal situation, one lives in a community where if you're pursuing the supreme good and trying to live a life of virtue, presumably the other people around you who are also doing the same are going to view you in a positive light partially because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. But I think where it's a problem is when it becomes an issue of trying to pursue. I think maybe this is what you're getting at. I would say we should never really be pursuing status for the sake of status, like in the definition you just gave, like for the sake of making sure that people think well of us. Like that should never be our aim. It's one of those things where that should never be the end. It could be an incidental good in a sense that might come from the proper end of pursuing the supreme good and pursuing a life of virtue, that through that those who are also doing that might view you in a positive light in the sense of status of what the community thinks of you. Fair enough. And that's not a bad thing.
Well, no, we believe in accountability.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Yeah, and so that's not a bad thing. But the difference is if it becomes an end in and of itself of I'm going to do X, Y, or Z thing so that I will fit in, for example. That's one of the things that has always bothered me is this culture of like, well, everyone else is doing that thing. And so why shouldn't we do that thing? Mm-hmm. And it's like, that's never a good reason to do anything. Like even good things, I would say, like, I mean, granted, yeah, sure, there's good peer pressure when it comes to prayer or, you know, our relationship with the Lord or whatever, but that's still not good enough. Like that's still not really something that we should be making into an end.
It's not the ideal. It's not like there have been certain sins in my life that I have overcome because of fear. It's fruitful, okay? But it's not the ideal way to overcome sin.
Well, and I think to that point, it won't be to the point of like the freedom thing that I was saying about John Edwards or whatever. Like it won't be long lasting too. Yeah. Like that fear can sometimes be the initial spark that brings us to the Lord or to repentance in some way or another, and that's good. But in order for us to actually break like a bad habit or a bad sin or a vice or whatever, it has to go from that step of the fear and the like, oh man, I shouldn't have done this, to the next step of like, I want to actually pursue the good.
Right.
I want to pursue some good that is inverse to this bad thing in some sense.
Yeah,
like,
I don't actually receive joy anymore. Like when I
do exactly. Yeah. And that's, I think in some ways, a great example of this that I was just talking about with my girlfriend last night was like, I have done Exodus 90 several times, this ascetical program during Lent, or well, before Lent too, but for 90 days where you kind of give up a bunch of different things. And the idea is to help you. Yeah, well, hopefully you mean that in the proper sense of like that it should give you more freedom so that you can like interact with the world better. But, but that's one of the things I have come to recognize from that, because we were having this conversation about how I don't tend to listen to a lot of like pop music or, you know, modern media or stuff like that anymore. And a lot of that is because I think a lot of it's not that great.
Yeah.
But also but it's not simply, so here's the thing. I think a lot of it's not that great. But for me, it doesn't end at, oh, well, this stuff isn't that great, so I don't want to participate in it because it's not that great. Where it ends for me is that I have the freedom. So like that was kind of the first step in some sense, the fear thing that we're talking about of like, man, this stuff is like not bringing me closer to the Lord. It's like there's a lot of like crude language or like inappropriate things, and man, I don't want that to be in my life because that'll like, you know, draw me away from the Lord. It'll draw me toward temptation, toward sin. That was where kind of some of the initial steps began, but I'm now at a point where mostly the reason that I don't engage in that stuff is because I have like gained the freedom that I'm just detached from it. Like I don't have any desire, to your point. Like it doesn't really bring me that much like pleasure or joy or happiness or whatever word you want to use in most of those things now. Cause I'm kind of like, like that's not really something if I want to go have fun, I'm going to go find some other way to have fun. Like those things don't really bring me the same kind of enjoyment that they did. And that's fine, because honestly, a lot of those things aren't that great anyway. But like, but those, I can find joy in a lot of much deeper things now that I didn't before because I was in this other way. But
yeah, I think I remember, because for Exodus 90, we give up like TV and stuff. And I remember there was like one night in the past 90 or 83 days where my wife and I, we did watch TV, and we kind of went to bed and we're like, that sucked.
Yep.
Like, I mean, not all TV's bad. Like, if you're watching a good movie, that can actually be really rewarding, you know? But if you're just watching to watch, it's really boring. And I've actually realized that I don't sleep well.
Oh yeah.
That's known. That's a known fact. More screen time does seem to mess with our sleep. But yeah. No, I think. No, I kind of like what we're saying. So, do you want to move on to maybe some other goods that we hold up as the highest goods? So we've talked a lot about material gain. We've talked about status.
And then we talked about status. Yep.
What are some things you think in our world, when it comes to like problems in the world that we're trying to deal with, but we hold as the highest good? Because I have one in mind that we did talk about that I wouldn't mind unpacking. Again.
Yeah, you mean like environmental things?
Yeah, environmentalism. Because I think this is environmentalism is such a hot button topic, because the environmentalists, they say, like, I understand where they're coming from. They say if the Earth isn't going to be here, then that's a big problem. Like, it's our planet, so therefore it should be the most important thing, the thing that we're focusing on right now, because if it dies, so do we. And I get where that's coming from. I do. But it's so much more complicated than that. So, for example, like we're trying to figure out what clean energy is. We have yet to really even figure that out.
Yeah.
Because everything has a byproduct.
Correct.
No matter how supposedly clean it is. It's also the way we obtain the energy isn't always the most ethical. Like, everyone's obsessed with electric cars. And albeit I was kind of like really into Teslas for a bit, and my dad has a Tesla, and it's very fun to drive. But not everyone can own a Tesla, first of all. Not everyone can own an electric car. From what I've heard, I'm not sure if this is just something people say, but we just don't have enough energy, like electric energy, to charge.
Well, currently, definitely not. The grid's not set up for that. Yeah.
But also the way in which the materials for the batteries are harvested by these African countries, where there's a woman who has a baby strapped to her chest, and she's wearing sandals, and she's mining, I think it's cobalt, which enables us to expand the size of batteries. But they can still hold the charge. It doesn't mess with the material, the chemistry too much. Cobalt, apparently, when you strike it, it sends off this gas, into the air, and they're inhaling it. And this woman has a baby strapped to her chest. Like, it's bad. Like, anything that is rechargeable, apparently, is coming off of the backs. The materials are coming off the backs of slaves. And it's like, oh, that's not saving. It's like, oh, we saved the planet, but we've enslaved people, like, to do so. Or you think of like energy that has like fossil fuels, people like to condemn a lot. And I understand why. But we have these really poor countries out there who can only afford fossil fuels as a source of energy. And these poor countries are trying to innovate and get to our status and deal with sickness and illness and starvation in their countries. But the only source of energy that they have access to are those fossil fuels. But we're telling them, hey, that's bad for the environment. You need to use this more expensive, eco-friendly source of energy to improve your economy. But they don't have the money because their economy isn't like. It's like I get the complaint. I love nature. I hate it when people tear down a forest and put apartments up. It drives me nuts.
Yep, same here.
I hate it. I'm not a big fan of over urbanization, but I'm also realistic about the fact that there are poor people out there, and we can't punish them for our own sins, And so when you make environmentalism the supreme good, like, it seems that we tyrannize the poor even more.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm realizing is so crucial about all this, and I think some of this comes out of the fact that I recently have been, there's what's it called, like a creator on YouTube or whatever, who I've sometimes listened to, who does these like longer form videos. They're like usually 12 to 20 minutes or whatever, little like mini documentary type videos on like topics or whatever.
Essay videos.
Yeah, exactly. Like, he's basically reading an essay, but it's like really engaging and interesting. And he's done some on like various different environmental things and energy and electricity and all these different things. And I think that's just emphasized for me. Like, he's given me the statistics, the kind of tools or whatever to articulate something that I already kind of felt, which is that I think the biggest issue in a lot of ways with any of these environmentalism things, environmentalists or whatever, who try to like make this into the supreme good, is this is exactly the problem with making anything the supreme good above the supreme good, is that you're turning things upside down. Like you're doing things in the backwards order. Like it's the same actually in one sense with, all right, hopefully you'll take this the right way, and I'm going to explain this a little bit, but it's the same reason why for a while at one time in my life, even as a Catholic who was very pro-life, and in some ways I've still been bothered by this sometimes, there can be a bad habit in pro-life communities at times to think that the solution to abortion is simply to illegalize it everywhere. Now, that's important and good, to be clear. Like we should try to have laws that make abortion illegal.
Yeah, legalizing murder is not good.
Wait, legalizing it. Yes, Yeah, exactly. Like we should have laws that make it illegal. But it can't end there.
No.
That's the issue that happens so often. And I think that's a great example of the same kind of thing that happens in the environmental thing. Is what has to happen is people's hearts have to be changed in such a way that they are desiring the good, ultimately the supreme good, who I would say is God, but people have to be living with that desire in mind, with that end goal in mind, and then those other things will fall into place with that. You see that so often with people who have who either didn't grow up Christian or Catholic, or they fell away at some time in their life, and they had these very like opposing views to certain, like I think even often this will happen when people who grew up Catholic, let's say, but then at some point in high school or college, they developed this view where, they were very pro some sort of issue or whatever that the church teaches is like, not something that basically are going against the church's teaching on something.
Yeah.
And what happens is it's not simply like, you can't just beat that person over the head with like, well, this is what the truth is, you should just get in line with it or whatever.
Yeah.
Their heart has to be transformed to desire the good, to desire the supreme good. And then you will see in those people this recognition of like, oh, I probably should actually think about this thing this way. Like they'll come to realize that. And I think the same thing is true with environmentalism kind of things, that like the solution is not simply like forcing electric vehicles on everyone, for example. Like, and I think one of the areas where that's so prominent, this is where I was going with this, is the issue of money, actually. Like because to your point about the poverty thing, it comes back a lot to like, there's definitely the ethical sourcing thing of like batteries and things like that, for sure. And then there's also the money aspect of who are the people who are putting forth the alternative energy solutions, and how much does it cost to put those alternative energy solutions, whether it be electrical vehicles or solar power or wind power or hydroelectric power or whatever. A lot of these quote unquote renewable energy sources are significantly more expensive to set up the infrastructure to be able to produce that energy and then transport it than the old school, quote unquote, traditional ways of, fossil fuels and nuclear power and various different other, and like natural gas and coal and things like that. And the problem is, again, I feel like this episode is going to sound like we're just critiquing capitalism back and forth, which like, to be clear on my, the Catholic Church opposes both capitalism and like socialism, Marxism, communism, all those things, because the Catholic social teaching perspective is like a middle ground sort of between all of those. So that's kind of why we can have the freedom on some level to like criticize capitalism too, because it's not the ultimate like best solution, I would say. But you see this problem partially because of capitalism, that there are companies who are trying to make money, who are the ones in charge of all of these energy things. And even though they might be moving toward a quote unquote renewable energy, a big part of that is because that's the latest like cultural thing. And so they know they need to get in line with that, but they're going to find the cheapest ways they can on their end. And that also, and at the same time, they're going to find the most effective way to make money. So you think about the electric vehicle thing, like electric vehicles are absurdly expensive still comparatively, like it, and it's just like the whole concept of all of these things often comes back to money, like,
Yeah. Well,
and greed and
yeah.
power, and
It seems, because even though the companies out there that just have these ads saying, "Hey, we're gonna by 2028, we're going to decrease our carbon
Oh my
footprint
gosh.
by 25%," and it's like, you don't give a crap about your carbon footprint. I know it. I'm sure there are people in the company who do, but the company itself, like as a whole, they care about making money.
So actually, to that point, I'm sorry, I just have to share
No,
this
do
because it's a
it,
really
man.
interesting tangent a little bit. But from that is that one of those videos I was just watching recently was pointing out that a big part of that carbon footprint reduction, quote unquote, is that there is basically this made up scam out there in the business world of clean energy credits. And what it is these companies will like take like it's like diabolical basically, but basically they're like, for example, like this guy was like pointing out some of these like examples of this. There are like forested areas, for example, that have been like reserved as like a natural preserve or national park or something that's already protected and sustained already. And then what happens is they sell these like clean energy credits, quote unquote, to companies, so the company can say, we're quote unquote offsetting our carbon footprint by paying for these clean energy credits, and literally they're doing nothing other than just paying some money to a place to say that they're helping with something. They're not actually doing anything. They're not impacting anything. The place is already protected too, so it's not like the idea behind the clean energy credits is supposed to be that they're protecting something that hasn't been protected yet.
Yep.
But the place is already protected from environmental things in that sense. And they're just basically paying to be able to say, we're doing this.
That is fascinating. I'm not surprised, but that's
Yep.
it doesn't surprise me the least bit, but that's insane to hear. And oh man, that's kind of funny.
And this is why the business world bothers me so much a lot of the time, is because the biggest motivator usually in the business world is how can you increase profit?
Yeah.
And so that means more revenue and less expenses.
I love it. I say ironically or sarcastically. But so, yeah, it's environmentalism. It's a good thing. It's good to care about the environment. God made us. He gave us dominion over creation. But creation itself is not God. God is God. And yeah, when it's out of order, everything just gets messy. And it really seems like it's all about money, though. Like, we're going to talk about all these supreme goods, or they're not supreme goods, but nominally supreme goods, and it seems like it's all rooted in money.
Well, it's about money and material. I think that's the thing. Like, what does money get you? It gets you material things, like material pleasure and happiness.
And material things give you status.
And I think, I guess to kind of cap off my thoughts on the environmentalism thing, I think one thing I was thinking of that I think is important is to recognize, like, our world gets so obsessed with global things, like, oh, well, this country needs to do this to cut down on carbon emissions or whatever, and this company is doing this, and we have electric vehicles and whatever else. And I think one of the points to his credit, I would say, of Pope Francis releasing his Laudato Si encyclical years ago is actually meant to be more, and granted, I haven't read it in its entirety or whatever, so I don't know fully how much I'm, hopefully I'm not completely off on this, but I do think that one of his points in that, and he also wrote a letter a couple years ago based on the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, who is well known for, being overly upheld by people to be this like nature tree hugging person or whatever, but he was very into that in a certain proper sense. And I think what's important about that is for each of us in our own lives, in the ways that we can actually influence things, to be conscious of those things. That's part of my point, I think, about changing hearts when it comes to the environmental aspect, is like for us to sit back and like kind of think about, like, okay, what are the things in my life? What are the ways that I can perhaps do some small things to try to like love the earth well? I don't know what the right word is exactly, but like respect probably is a better word, I should say, because I mean, you can't really love the earth in the truest sense of like what love actually means. But
They don't make
you
out
can't
with
really
the
will the
tree.
good of the other of the earth because the earth is not a person. But
Right.
but like, despite the fact that we say Mother Earth and all that stuff, and the earth is not a person. So, but you can like respect the earth in a really healthy way. And I think the important thing there is to not just, we shouldn't throw aside environmental things because of the problems, but also focus more on like, what can I do in my personal life, with my family, with whoever, like, to like, in small ways, contribute to a healthier, earth and society.
This reminds me of something I wanted to say. I was teasing my students yesterday. I'm always teasing them. When it comes to living the good life, and trying to have this impact on the world, for example, like in the context of our conversation, we're talking about helping out the environment.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely absurd to think that you can have a drastic impact on the world.
Oh yes, you mean like on the whole world as a broad whole.
Yeah, you were kind of criticizing earlier like the globalist mentality,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I was telling my students, I'm like, when you guys graduate, someone's gonna get up there and say, "Go out and change the world," and I looked at them, I'm like, you guys aren't gonna change a thing, okay?
Yeah.
You yourself are not going. Like it's the issue I have with the existence of politicians is.
Yeah.
Is like when you walk up there and you say, I'm running for this so-and-so position and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z and be the change. And I'm like, what makes you think that, like, out of all the people on this planet, that you've got it figured out enough to fix the world? Like, that's absolutely absurd.
Yep.
It's just, it's egotistical. It's supremacist. It's not possible for you to change, even if you get that position of authority.
Exactly. Because it doesn't have as much power and authority as you actually think it does.
Yeah, and even if it does, you're not gonna do anything, man. Like you're just going to cause a lot of problems, most likely. And sure, there have been people in history who have had great impacts. Sure, but you're not gonna. Maybe we could count a couple hundred, maybe even 1,000 people. Okay. Who have had serious impacts on history. That's 1,000. And guess what? There's 8 billion people currently on this planet. That's not counting all the people who have existed in history.
Yeah.
It's just that's one of the problems, I think, with this making environmentalism the supreme good, or maybe even going out and having an impact on the world. And now we feel like that's possible because everyone can influence something.
I was just thinking about that. Like I was again thinking back to the TikTok thing again of like, I think this is one of the reasons why things like TikTok bother me so much, because it gives people this delusional concept of globalism in the really unhealthy sense of it, of like, oh, you can go be an influencer and change the world. And like, that's not how that works. Like,
and I think to your point is you have to ask yourself the question, what can I do in my own life?
Exactly.
And I was telling my students, and this is not my idea, this has been said hundreds of thousands of times by people much smarter than I. The best thing you can do is love your family.
Yeah.
Is to be a good parent, to care for your children, to care for your spouse. It's literally the best thing you can do.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's where it comes back to, I beat this drum a lot, but like, to his credit, like Stephen Covey, who's the relatively famous writer of the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of the probably best things from that book, there's a lot of good things in that book, but one of the best things is he makes this distinction between the circle of influence and the circle of concern, and how important it is to focus on the circle of influence, which is, your family, the people around you on a day-to-day basis, versus the circle of concern, which is like all these global things. And he's not saying you entirely ignore the circle of concern insofar that, bury your head in the sand and not be aware of anything going on in the world. But his point is you can't really impact the circle of concern. And so it should be a lot less of your time than the circle of influence.
Otherwise, you're wasting it. You're literally wasting your time. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I think we've solved the world's problems. No, I'm just kidding. No. What do you think are maybe some other goods out there? I mean, let's do it for the sake of conversation. TikTok, okay?
Yeah.
We had a discussion that you think TikTok itself is actually just not a good at all, and you said it is not a good because the programming in it is specifically geared towards addiction.
Yes.
And therefore something in that nature can just not be a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what I was drawing on was that there's various different concepts in like moral theology and kind of the understanding of morals of how we both intentions. So in actual like action, an object, an action, and an intention are like the three big things that you examine in that oftentimes.
Object, intention, and circumstance. You said object, action, which object and action are sometimes. It's object, intention, and circumstance.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, I think because object and action those are terms used, but they're used interchangeably. Like action
Yeah.
is,
Okay. Yeah. I think I was more thinking object in the physical sense in this case, but yeah, you're right. You're right that in moral theology it's object, intention, circumstance. But so the point is that like the point that I'm drawing is that there are certain things there are certain artifacts that are created with good purposes. Mm-hmm. There are certain artifacts that are created with like I would say diabolical or immoral, evil purposes. And there are certain artifacts, and again, to clarify, when I say artifact, it's a philosophical term that basically just means an object created by humans.
Okay.
And there are certain artifacts that are created with a neutral thing. Like they're just kind of, a pen. Like a pen is like a neutral artifact. Like it's not really created for, a moral good in the sense of, serving some deep moral purpose. But it's also there's nothing bad about a pen. Like it could be used in a negative way, but it's not, because I could take a pen and I could stab you with it or something. And like that could be, that's not good.
But we're not going to blame the pen.
But exactly. It's not the pen's fault. And so like that's an aspect of understanding kind of the way that objects can be created and and then the other aspect of that kind of goes in line with like the form of the thing is the intention behind it and how it's designed and what its intention was for. So I think we used the example last time of certain contraceptives. And I think the important thing again here to distinguish for people when it comes to philosophy too is to understand that things are created for specific purposes, and even things that are created for bad purposes could theoretically be used in some cases for good purposes. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. But oftentimes, if they're used for a good purpose, it requires changing them in some way.
Yeah,
would be the argument. So what we used was the argument of. Go ahead.
Were you going to talk about the contraceptive?
Yeah.
But I want to. I actually am. Well, the one reason I was happy that our episode.
Oh, you want to go with a different?
I didn't want to.
Yeah, that's fine.
Weird,
I'm fine with that.
To hear my students.
What example do you want to use?
Something that is made for evil. Yeah, sure, made for evil, but repurposing it for something good. Do you have something in mind?
Not off the top of my head.
Let's think of something evil.
Wish I had thought of that. I mean, I guess, okay, so I guess the argument that I'm making, I think I can do it in this way, that it's not necessarily that the object itself is wrong, because I'm not sure that's even really possible per se, but it's more about the intention behind the creation of that thing is negative, and so therefore the only way that one could quote unquote use it in a good way would be to actually use it against its proper intention.
Okay, yeah, because the reason you hold TikTok to be evil is because the programming within its form is to be addicting.
So to use a like really basic example, let's say now again, this is why I'm clarifying intention, because obviously, well, I guess we don't. I don't know. It would like a weapon be okay to use? Like, are you okay with that?
Yeah.
example?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah,
okay.
The other
okay.
one was just
no. That's fine.
specific.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I'm just clarifying. You're okay with that? Okay. So let's say like a gun. Like, let's say somebody creates a gun specifically with the intention of using it for, like, actually, I think a better example in some ways would be like some sort of torture weapon or something.
Yeah, because that's clearly
with the intention to torture people. Like, it's not created to be used for self-defense. It's not created to be used in some sort of just defense of something. It is only created for the purpose and the sake of torturing someone, whatever this theoretical weapon is. Now, let's say that, let's say it's like one of those big old style like hammer, what do you call that? The like ball things or whatever, that was used for torture sometimes.
I'm not familiar with torture
It's like
devices.
a giant spike. It's like a giant metal ball with spikes on it is what I'm thinking. That's what I'm picturing.
Yeah,
but
okay, yeah.
so let's say that somebody then turns around and uses that to like break down a wall because it's like a big metal ball. And so like
I could do this
it's
thing,
a relatively, you know, like let's just say it's a drywall or something. So it's not that strongly enforced. You could take that torture device and you could use it to bash down that wall.
Right.
Now, bashing down the wall, let's say you're just like renovating your home or something. So it's not like there's nothing wrong with bashing down that wall. You're not using that torture device in a bad way. You're just using it for like a neutral, like fine, that's perfectly fine use of it. But that's not the purpose that it was designed for.
Right.
So you're not really using it in the way that it was properly intended.
Yeah.
You're like changing what it's designed for. You're changing its meaning by using it in a different way. My argument to your point with TikTok is that unlike certain social media platforms, like let's say Facebook, when it first started, like, you know, regardless of like, I would say that now I think Facebook isn't that great either because of the algorithms and all that stuff that it's designed for. But when it originally started, Facebook was designed to be literally just a way of people communicating with each other and being able to stay in touch in this like quote unquote social network. Great, fine. That's, you know, there's nothing inherently bad about that purpose. Years later, as social media has evolved through Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all these different things, people discovered over time that they can use these algorithms to advertise things and influence people by proposing, you know, we've talked about this with Facebook, I think, of like how it will selectively show certain people certain posts, certain ads, certain various different articles or things like that based on what it decides, what the algorithm decides is like what that person should see. And so again, we're kind of influencing what they take in based on this. My argument with TikTok is that it was literally designed for the purpose of influencing people in a very intentional manner that is not good.
Yeah.
That is designed to try to get people hooked on it for one thing, like it exists to sell itself on some level, but then also I would say even more deeply to get people to be influenced by various cultural ideologies, I think would be what I would suggest. Like it's very clearly designed to, you know, to flow through certain ideologies. And I mean, we could also get into the fact that, you know, I'm not going to go down this road too far, but I'm just going to point it out a little bit that like it's also one of the only ones that is run or was developed by a country and is very clearly, you know, run by a country that has been known to do a lot of things to influence what their people take in. Mm-hmm. And then they brought it to the US, which seems to suggest that they want to influence what young people, especially in the US, are taking in. Mm-hmm. And it has become very formative. Like there are a lot of people who get their news, their ideologies about the world, their perspectives on things from TikTok. And that is very, very dangerous. And I would say that that's like inherently in the design of TikTok, which is why I think I actually have thought about this a little bit more, that I think I would say that in theory, one could perhaps use TikTok in a good or positive way, but it would be very difficult because not only would that be going against the design of it, in my argument, because of the inherent nature of a social media platform like that has these algorithms and is like run by people who are programmers, it would be very hard to go against that design because they can influence who sees your content, how they see your content, when it, you know, like, so you can't even really control how your content is released or distributed or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that just kind of came to my mind is like, let's say there's something evil like a strip club,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but we start. Let's say we go to a strip club and we take over a booth, and we decide to say, hey, we're gonna give a talk on chastity, like at this booth, and everyone is free to like show up to the strip club to hear this talk because this is the only venue we could get.
Yeah,
you can make an argument that, okay, sure, that's that's a good purpose, okay, to give a talk on chastity. But like at a strip club, like you can't go into the den of thieves and expect like fruit to come from it. It's like TikTok. Like TikTok is like
Exactly.
this
I love
evil
that
place,
comparison. Yep.
and you can't expect like, okay, we're posting Christian content or good content on TikTok. It's like, okay, but the clear, you're bringing the person into a terrible place that is just bound to trap them there.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's a great point. That's the thing too, is that no matter how much you put, Christian content on TikTok, the nature of TikTok, that person's almost certainly going to see a bunch of videos that are not Christian content that are probably going to at the same time influence them in a different direction too.
Or they're just going to be addicted.
And exactly. And that's also not healthy. And to anticipate one of the arguments against which I love that scenario you just used of the strip club situation of preaching giving a chastity talk or whatever, to anticipate an argument against that too. I could hear people, because I've had people say this kind of thing to me before, like, well, Jesus went and, ate with the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the sinners and all that. And the most easily, readily available response to that is, guess what? That's Jesus. We are not the Son of God. We don't have the ability ourselves to go into a really sinful environment and not be impacted by it.
Yeah.
We are, yes, we should reach out to those who are in need of, repentance and healing and all that. But the ways that we should do that reaching out may have to look a little bit different than our Lord, because he was entirely without sin himself, and being the Son of God had the ability to do those things. We are weak, fallen human beings. It would not be prudent for, you or I to go into a strip club and go preach a talk on chastity. And the same thing could be true, I would say, of TikTok.
Yeah, I think that's something we have to consider a lot with Jesus' actions. That we do need to remember that he is God. And so when he's dialoguing with the Pharisees, and it says in the scriptures that he knows what is on their heart. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, because he's God. And we as humans, we try to do, ever since psychology has become super popular, we've tried to act like that I can discern what's really going on within you.
Yeah.
And I can make an educated guess, but it's never guaranteed. Jesus could do that because, like I said, he was God. So, yeah, I think that makes sense why TikTok is just unsalvageable. And I know we've kind of discussed, would we ever put stuff, let's say we start doing video podcasts, we start doing clips, would we put those clips on TikTok? Yeah, I don't.
Well, I think we even talked last in that one that didn't get released about whether we would even do YouTube Reels. Or what is it called? What's that called?
Shorts.
That's not Reels. Shorts. Yeah, sorry. YouTube Shorts. I was
Reels,
confused
Shorts,
with Instagram.
Same thing. Yeah. No, I think what we would do is we would do clips where.
Oh, sure. Like a 3 to 5 minute clip or whatever. 2 minute. Yeah.
But no, you're right. Well, see, there's something when you look at things like TikTok, and if I ask kids what they want to do, they just want to be entertained. And it's not just kids, it's us too. We're constantly craving entertainment, which I think is something Exodus 90 and Lent itself is being used now to counteract effectively too. And it's why? Where does this desire to be constantly entertained come from? And I think it comes from the desire to just be distracted nonstop from the difficulties of the world. And so a lot of people make comfort the highest good.
Yep.
Which is also another absurd thing, because you're going to suffer.
Yep.
And if you haven't, lucky you, but it's going to happen. You will suffer. And if you're running away from it, it's going to stab you in the back. The best way to face it is attacking it head on. And constantly desiring comfort is not a way to achieve happiness.
Yeah, and I think that's a great tie back into our main topic from this episode, is that recognition of comfort. I think is another thing that we place above how it should be. We view it as the supreme good at times. And I think even to loop back into, I think I said something at the very beginning about sacrifice, the idea of sacrifice. And I think that's where sacrifice can be almost like the counteraction of comfort or whatever, insofar that we intentionally deny ourselves of some pleasure or some comfort or some good that we might desire. That's not a bad thing in and of itself.
No.
But we intentionally take that thing away from ourselves for a time, for a day or a moment or whatever, and it helps us to detach ourselves more so that we're not always constantly pursuing comfort. Mm-hmm. We can then be more able to sit in that suffering and sit in those difficult moments and not just try to escape. Because I think that's one of the things that happens so often today is escapism. You hear it with psychology a lot of like people trying to find escapes. And I think that's, that's what you see with the, the culture of people just sitting and binge watching a TV show for, 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours. Like, and don't get me wrong, we've all done that at some point in our lives, but just like a lot of that comes down to this desire to escape reality because reality is difficult. It's hard at times. There's suffering and that's, I think that's a great way to, that it's just funny you said that because it helped me like put into words even better, I think, what I was talking about with my girlfriend last night of like that detachment thing I was saying that like, I think I've like become less, and I'm by no means am I saying I'm perfect in this at all, but like, I think through Exodus 90 and stuff, I've detached more from a lot of the things that that I used to use as a way to try to distract myself, essentially. Like the various different modern media, TV, like music, things like that like they were there more as a distraction than as like something that I was actually receiving true, like proper, good, healthy pleasure and enjoyment out of. It was more just like, I'm going to go, because a big crutch for me has always been TV, that like, if I'm not feeling great in the mental sense, I'll try to go watch a TV show or something. And like, even I had even fallen back into the habit before we started this most recent, like Exodus 90 or whatever. And I had to kind of re-break that habit again of like, okay, don't just turn to a TV show right now. Like, just sit with it, let it be there, go pray, go do something, like go read something, read a book, like find some other outlet that's like less just kind of mindlessly escaping, but actually like doing some sort of active leisure activity where like you might still have to think about that thing that's tough a little bit, but you don't necessarily always have to sit in it, but you shouldn't just run away from it either.
Yeah, because if we don't address these things, we lose the ability to confront problems.
Yeah.
And problems are inevitable, so that means every problem we encounter after losing the ability will become a bigger problem. And yeah, running away from it doesn't help. And that's not to condemn like rest there.
No, that's why I was
Jesus
just saying the thing about
rested,
finding good leisure activities.
Yeah,
but
Jesus himself rested. But and we're called to rest once a week. But the rest itself is not the good.
But I think that's where like
good.
I think that's where the thing with leisure needs to be not, I think I've used the word productive before, and I like that's a good word to use because that's a little too much in our modern like productivity culture.
Yeah.
But I think a good word maybe to use would be like some sort of engaging leisure activity. And what I mean by that is something that actually engages us. Because the reality is that a lot of media does not actually engage us in the truest sense of engagement. Like what I mean is it's just like something that you're mindlessly like watching versus an engagement with, music. Like if you're, if you enjoy like playing an instrument or singing or whatever, and like that can be a leisure activity. Or, going out for a walk in nature where you can kind of be like engaging like the things around you in the world. Mm-hmm. Or, I'm not thinking of the best. I'm sure there's plenty of other examples we could give, but like, or even reading a book. Like reading a book is more engaging to our mind than mindlessly sitting in front of a TV. And again, not to like condemn that completely. Like obviously, there are times when you can watch like a nice, good movie or whatever. But on the whole, I think people have much more of a proclivity nowadays to just dive right into the mindless activity that doesn't engage their mind versus some sort of engaging leisure activity.
Yeah, and we just end up destroying ourselves if we don't engage, which goes back to this idea of if we don't have something as the supreme good in the place of the supreme good, it'll rule our lives, it'll destroy us. And back to Pageau.
Yep.
Just because we have all this stuff doesn't mean we're going to be happy. And actually, evidence has shown that the more stuff you have, the less happy you are, actually. So, I think we're pretty...
Yeah, I think my one little cap that I want to put on all of this, because I'm realizing that we've kind of talked a lot about negatives, not in the sense of like, everything's awful, but negatives in the sense of like positive learning versus negative learning or whatever. We've talked a lot about like the negative learning of like the via negativa of like, well, here's what we shouldn't be engaging in here. I think just to add like a little bit of positivity to this of like, I think I would suggest that like to Pageau's point, like if we are able to kind of attempt to reorient our lives so that we're focusing on the supreme good, which I would say is God, and then kind of go down the line from there of family and, relationships with people, maybe school or work or whatever down there somewhere, and begin to try to live that I think that can be an encouragement to try to help us encounter this a little more deeply. And that's where I would say too, that I think sacrificing can be a helpful way to do that. Like we're going to be releasing this ideally during Holy Week, I think.
Yeah.
And Holy Week is a great time to reflect on the sacrifice of our Lord on the cross for us, and also the ways that we, throughout this Lent may or may not have lived well sacrifice. But also the fact that throughout our lives, we're called to sacrifice in many different ways, whether it be through marriage in the future or, a celibate vocation or our jobs or whatever other situation. I mean, even for the teenagers out there, think about how many sacrifices you make in your sports things. You get up earlier, you go work out in a way that you might not be feeling in that moment. So just the encouragement to begin to turn our sacrifices toward the supreme good and toward helping ourselves to detach more from these worldly goods so that we can live more toward that supreme good.
Yeah. And if you're anxious or stressed out, it's probably because your hierarchy of goods is out of whack. And I catch myself, if I'm always stressed out, it's because I'm too focused on work or maybe frustrated with what I can't control about my family. So if you want a peaceful life, if you want a taste of eudaimonia, keep your eyes focused on the actual supreme good.
Yep.
And then hopefully your fears and anxieties will, over time, subside. But it's difficult. It's like exercise. It's like prayer. You're not going to be good at it right away.
No, exactly.
And this is actually why you need to pray, because if you're not praying, you're not reevaluating yourself. You're not reflecting, and you become less aware of who you are. And so all of this must be accompanied by prayer.
Yep.
So I think something also, I really should have said this at the beginning of the episode, but if anyone ever has any questions, please shoot us an email. Our email is in our description. It'd be so much fun, just honestly, to have episodes where we field questions.
Yeah, we would love to do that. So please email us questions at ofmountainsandmenpodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, and I can say your name on the podcast if you want me to, but if you're embarrassed about your question, I won't share your name.
I would say kind of like on other podcasts, say if you want it to be anonymous, because otherwise we probably will read the name for the sake of
accidentally. But it would that would be so much fun just to field questions.
Yeah, we would love that. So
wonderful. Well, this will be coming out during the Triduum, or right before the Triduum on Tuesday of Holy Week. So I pray everyone has a good Holy Week and a joyful Easter as we celebrate the resurrection of our Lord.
Absolutely. Amen.
All right. Everyone take care. God bless.